So, now that the dust is settling on the first tier of Warlords of Draenor, how is Retribution faring in the grand scheme of things and where is it headed? I'm going to recap a few elements of how Retribution has worked up to now and then focus in on what the current state of play is for 6.2. Regardless of any changes that inevitably come with the new expansion, the new round of talents is always the main new thing. For Retribution, it brought in 3 playstyle changing abilities. The least invasive was Final Verdict. It's largely passive and only changes the way you cleave and AoE. Seraphim brought in a short duration, high resource cost buff. Think Inquisition's Big Brother on crack. Finally, we had Empowered Seals, which brings in a form of seal twisting that has generated a lot of ire from players not keen on wasting so many GCDs on a short duration buff. All 3 have their fans and detractors, as they result in 3 completely different playstyles. In High Maul, all 3 saw service. Then came Blackrock Foundry and the tier bonuses. This effectively caused all Retribution Paladins to adopt the same combination of Final Verdict and Divine Purpose. No longer did players have a choice of N-tier talents if they wanted to compete. The idea that tier bonuses force you to completely change playstyle is nothing new, and was very much a feature in MoP. Looking ahead to Hellfire Citadel, the same thing is happening. This is not based on detailed sims, but by looking at the new set bonuses. We can see that Final Verdict is likely to fall by the wayside and be replaced by potentially Seraphim, but most likely Empowered Seals. We look at some of the reasons for this. First of all, Mastery is being nerfed. This isn't just for Retribution, it appears to be happening for all classes and specs where Mastery was way ahead as the most powerful secondary stat. Nonetheless, this weakens Final Verdict because the ability is buffed by our Mastery. Both Seraphim and Empowered Seals buff all of our abilities, whether they benefit from Mastery or not. Before I talk about the new tier bonuses, I need to mention 2 other features of Retribution that are of concern to the general Mythic raiding rec community, namely Exorcism and RNG. For several tiers now, our set bonuses have been providing some compunction to use Exorcism outside of its normal priority. Exorcism has changed a lot over the years. It's an archetypal paladin spell. As such, I can absolutely understand why Blizzard want to keep it in the game. However, it's very weak on single target, and is only really useful in AoE if glyphed. As such, it's our lowest priority holy power generator much of the time. To combat this, Blizzard have used the tier bonuses to encourage its use for other effects, most recently to provide 3 holy power if used after a Hammer of Wrath. In tier 18, it's going to give us a chance to reduce the cooldown on our Avenging Wrath as things currently stand. That second point was RNG. I'm not going to go into a great deal about this, as there are already 2 comprehensive posts about it on the US and EU official forums. I've provided links in the comments below. The US entry has been provided by Solsacra, probably the world's main Retribution theory crafter, and the EU entry by Dakeshi, the world's highest achieving Retribution Paladin by progress at the moment. All I will say on this score is that the key to progress is consistency. If we're asked to burst down a priority ad in a certain amount of time, we need to be consistent in the damage we can output. If that damage isn't high enough, then fine, we aren't the class for that job. But it's no good being the best for that task one pull, and then the worst the next pull, based purely on whether or not we get procs. Now, as Tier 18 won't favour Divine Purpose in the same way Tier 17 has, we may not be quite as proc heavy. But the RNG doesn't seem to have been reduced. If anything, it may be worse. So, the 2-set bonus of Exorcism reducing the cooldown of our Avenging Wrath sounds awesome. We do loads of damage during Avenging Wrath, especially if we're not using Divine Purpose, and so more of that means more damage. Just one problem. We don't always use Avenging Wrath off cooldown. It may be available when we aren't able to attack the boss, something that happens on more than one occasion in Hellfire Citadel as far as I can tell. You might have to save it for a priority ad coming up again. Again, this is going to happen on some of the bosses in Tier 18. In short, we may favour using Exorcism above higher damage holy power generators and then end up wasting a fair chunk of that reduced cooldown that we gain from it. The worst thing is that there's no way to realistically plan for this because that Exorcism only gives us a chance to reduce the cooldown. We then have the problem of the Legendary Ring. For those that don't know, this gives a version of Heroism, or Bloodlust if you're Horde, that's controlled by your raid leader. Well, the chances of being able to get this buff to line up with your Avenging Wrath could already potentially mean that you'd have to hold off on Avenging Wrath for a bit anyway. But what chance now when you don't even know what the cooldown of Avenging Wrath is? You might end up getting no benefit from the 2-set at all, or it may line up beautifully. The swing effects that this will have on our damage could be astronomical. Our 4-set bonus again sounds awesomely powerful, but is just as much of a pain in the ass. For every second that our Avenging Wrath is active, we get a stacking buff to our damage. Great. Except this now means we have to pay more careful attention to when we fire off our execution sentence, and may be at the mercy of trinket procs. Getting procs as we fire off Avenging Wrath that then fade before the buff has ramped up means another huge RNG effect on the benefit we get from such procs. This is to say nothing of the distance it makes between getting kind empowered Divine Storm procs and none at all. The only saving grace here is if we don't end up using Final Verdict, as seems likely, it'll not be as big a swing as it otherwise could be. That brings me on to the issue of trinkets. The Archimon trinkets look excellent for many classes, particularly for Retribution, but there's another sting in the tail, as it again changes our behaviour. The trinket gives us a buff to our damage every time we use Crusader Strike or Hammer of the Righteous. In many ways this is great. It is an effect that depends on our play, as opposed to procs outside of our control. It stacks up to 3 times if used on the same target. If we use Crusader Strike or Hammer on a different target, it will reset our stacks. Well, that causes yet another layer of annoyance. We have to be extremely careful about our use of those abilities in several situations. When Censure Cleaving, for example, we have to ensure that we keep using Crusader Strike against the same target. If changing target to a priority add, you may have to wait for the 3 stack to naturally fade before using it again. One little slip and you could be losing a lot of damage. Now, learning this behaviour will be within the abilities of a lot of Mythic Ret Raiders, but it's still a change to our playstyle. It's a challenge to our muscle memory and the teacher of a bad habit that we'll have to kick for the next tier when we no longer have that trinket. However, for players who don't spend as long a time trying to perfect their art, it will just serve to make their spec even more inconsistent with output in the eyes of their fellow raiders. This in turn is likely to mean heroic raiding guilds and pugs simply consider Retribution Paladins to be more trouble than they're worth. Speaking of worth, what are we worth in raids? Like any DPS, our worth is measured in utility and output. Now, I would argue that our output was pretty strong in Highmoor, pretty good also in the first couple of months of Blackrock Foundry. We were very good at bursting priority adds. I, for one, always tried to make sure I was top damage on such priorities as Aberrations and War Mages on Margok, the Mounts on Darmak, Elementalists and Bellows Operators on Blast Furnace, etc., etc. However, as the tier's gone on and gear has improved, especially with that random 5-item level buff we have scaled hideously. I now struggle to compete on these priority adds in quite the same way. There are still fights I'm strong for, but not quite as many as it once was. Retribution Paladins who still have a way to go in progressing this tier are likely to feel increasingly weakened for the tasks ahead, and that is a great shame. In terms of our utility, we effectively have hands, with only sacrifice and protection being useful this tier. Even then, they are often not used, as those hands also come in Holy and Protection Paladin flavours. Both specs are consistently strong, so raid guilds will invariably have at least one Holy Paladin, and often a Protection Paladin as well. As such, even when there's a fight that needs Hand of Sacrifice or Hand of Protection, there's no guarantee that ours will still necessarily be needed. In my view, we really need some utility that benefits the whole raid, whether this is in the form of a Fire and Forget cooldown, such as the Warrior's Rallying Cry or Rogue's Smoke Bomb, or a passive effect, such as the Windwalker movement increase. All of those abilities are useful on all fights and make it worth bringing those classes in for. Our hands are pretty ultra niche at best. Now, I realise that all sounds like a litany of woe, but I have actually enjoyed playing Retribution this tier. There's only 2 out of the 17 bosses being exceptions to that. That being said, Retribution Paladins, like no other DPS class, are going to have to massively change their playstyle yet again in order to be competitive. This inevitably means that some will fail to adapt, and there will be a huge variance in corresponding output between pulls and between the top percentiles and, say, middle percentiles. There's also the issue that when you put the game changes of Tier 18 together, namely the tier bonuses, Legendary Ring, and Archimon Trinket, they actively seem to work against one another. This would be worrying enough in itself, but Retribution has always had perceptions to fight when it comes to raid places. Perceptions that become magnified whenever a mistake is made with the spec. Although I've been mostly pleased with the way Retribution has been so far, and Blizzard deserves some benefit of the doubt, there have nonetheless been issues that affect lower progress players disproportionately, but also all of us at every level of progress. When everyone else is watching the world first race between Method and Paragons, my world first race is for the guild who clears the tier first with a Retribution Paladin, and to see if they can actually manage to sneak into the top 10. And that is not the way it's meant to be.